disagreement between folks like Noam Chomsky, for example, and I forget the name of there's an author who wrote a book called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, Everett. I think Everett was his name. Daniel Everett. But he was a Christian missionary that went and lived in the Amazon with his family for 25 years or so, with a particular tribe, and studied their language, and basically came back to argue against Noam Chomsky that not all human languages have some sort of universal grammar that they all share, but instead that there's differences. But one thing that we pretty much agree on is that all human languages have recursion. You ever heard of that? If you look it up, you look up on Google recursion. What is recursion? Shoot, it used to be funny because it would always ask you, what is recursion? And I would say, well, did you mean recursion? I would say, yes. What is recursion? And I would say, do you mean recursion? In other words, Google was playing a joke on you, because recursion is when you get the same thing reoccurring, basically, right? And part of that is, I just asked you, have you ever heard about recursion? I just asked you, didn't I just say to you, what is recursion, right? And you basically do that ad infinitum, theoretically, to annoy everybody, basically. But that's a characteristic, it seems, of human languages that we're not certain any other animals that have languages, elephants, dolphins, and so on, they might not have recursion. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of human languages. But let me get back to Plato, because all this creates problems for Plato and his theory, because Plato is clearly thinking that the ideas are Greek ideas, that what structures the entire universe are Greek ideas, which of course, even when we're trying to understand what Plato's talking about today, and we might look back at some of the free translations that are on the web are fairly old, actually. There are updated ones. And of course, you might have to pay for those, because if you're buying a book that has an updated translation, the author or the translator still gets a cut, right? So there's that issue. Whereas the older ones, of course, are maybe 50, 70, 100 years old. Some of the Jowett translations are, I think, at least 150 years old. How about the Bible? How many folks are familiar with a thing called the Bible? You ever heard of it? It means library, right? But nonetheless, there's a version of it called the King James Bible. I had a student once who thought that the King James version, translation of the Bible, was the original. Right? And you probably have heard some people think, if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Right? But yes, you all know that, no, English didn't even exist then. Same thing with, the Ten Commandments. Some people would give me 10 Commandments and they give Roman numerals. Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2. No, they didn't have Roman numerals for those. Just silly stuff. So Greek is the universe structured according to Greek ideas. It's clearly something that Plato was unaware of, that we are, of course, today, because it's so obvious that there's so many different languages and that our ideas don't match necessarily. Lara, in her TED Talk there, will mention the differences between blue and other, so different languages have different ways of seeing colors, and they've done lab studies of people, and yes, that actually makes an impact on how people recognize things in their environment, whether their language has a specific color for a specific shade of color, and other languages don't, right? It'll make a difference. So there are going to be problems with this. That's pretty obvious. But in the Phaedo, one of the concepts is the Psyche. The Psyche is the soul, we would translate it today. I mean, we might have lots of different models of how to interpret what the Greeks were talking about, but we all agree that they were concerned about this soul. And my quiz question for you today, by the way, is kind of a double quiz question. The one kind of piggybacks on the talk we had last class about the Meno, and that you're, clearly Plato doesn't think your personality, your self can change over time, but that your personality is fixed. Your soul is fixed, right? So you really can't learn virtue. You either have it or you don't, right? It's kind of interesting that way. But it's your soul that he's concerned about. And when you think about Psyche and the soul, what you're trying to figure out is what on earth were the Greeks thinking the soul was, right? It's like the ideas, it's abstract, has no parts. Your soul has no parts. And that's interesting, because if you're familiar with Euclid, the elements, and we want, say, this is after Aristotle. But notice that the one translation of it, let's see, definitions, maybe I want definitions, but the definition of a point is that which has no parts. So we're going to see that idea that something can exist that has no parts. And if you think about it, what on earth would that mean? When you're talking about a line, for example, and a point has no parts, it actually has no dimensions, right? So we would say it doesn't exist, really, right? So when you talk about a line, this is a line from point A to point B, right? If I draw a physical line, that's an analogy or an allegory of a line, because it's actually a physical, and we always say two-dimensional, but if you look close, it's actually three dimensions, right? Because there's depth to the ink on the board, right? It's just very, very low, but actually we can't have anything that exists in just two dimensions in three-dimensional space, even a line, right? So we can say this is a line, and that's closer to Euclid than a physical line, but it consists of parts that are points, and the points have no parts. The smallest thing is something that has no parts, right? Which gives us all kinds of problems when you talk about the infinite. How many kinds of it, this infinite line is clearly smaller than this infinite line. I mean, how many problems can you have, associated with the infinite? All kinds of problems, because in a sense it's a model that doesn't fit all kinds of cases, right? So it's an interesting problem. By the way, I would argue that mathematics, by the way, is a Greek word. Math for the Greeks means knowledge. A mathematikos is a person who knows things, right? But in any case, when we talk about the soul, the Greeks say the same thing about the soul. The soul has no parts. Let's see if I can. And we of course get the idea that you have a body and a soul. Or as C.S. Lewis says, a soul that has a body, not a body that has a soul, right? So either way you want to go, right? My quiz question for you is, do you have a soul? And if you do, what is it? Or do you know what it is? I mean, the other possible quiz question is, is your personality fixed from birth, right? I think, Matt, you or someone mentioned is this the nature-nurture question, right? And yes, absolutely. This is, I guess, the original question about it. But you have the idea from the Greeks that your soul has no parts, and then somehow is co-located with your body. My favorite modern explanation of that is what's called the orchestrated objective reduction theory. Did I spell that right? Or abbreviated ORC, O-R. Of course, when I just call it ORC, O-R, it doesn't take long before I forget how to say orchestrated objective reduction theory. These are the two guys that are associated with it. Roger Penrose is a mathematician. He was the co-author with Stephen Hawking in A Brief History of Time, just to connect the dots with him. And he's got all kinds of marvelous things out there. A description of the whole world, et cetera. He describes all the physics and everything. But when you get right down to it, our contemporary problem is the quantum. Because when everybody knows we have atoms. You get this in high school, right? We have atoms. The atoms consist of parts. Which parts? Neutrons. Which is funny because atom means uncuttable. So that's the Greek word. They didn't fix it, right? The Latin word, by the way, is a monad. And we'll see that, a monad, we have monads as opposed to atoms. So one, basically, But so atoms are made of parts, and the parts are made of other parts, right? So we have the standard model. However you want to look at it. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I just meant to build this up, but you get the idea. These are, I think, the current ones. Is it up? It should be updated, right?
Yeah.
So it's Wikipedia. I think the latest one that they found was the Higgs, right? But so basically we have all these parts, and now, how are these parts made up? What makes up these parts? Because, notice our language requires that everything has parts.
That's string theory, right?
We do have string theory. It's all mathematics. We don't know how many different strings there might be, and so on.
Well,
But
that's that idea of the string versus a point, like you were talking about earlier. A line exists, but a point doesn't.
it could be a closed string that
Right.
wiggles like a donut hole, basically. That's fascinating stuff, but notice none of these exist. I mean, atoms exist, because atoms are matter, right? But once you get below atoms, you're subatomic, and subatomic particles